Hi guys, today I'm going to tell you a bit of a story about a little bit of history of English stuff, a little bit of etymology stuff, and sort of explaining why those two things are connected in the way that they are. So first of all, a couple of principles that we need to understand. The first, let's look at these two people here. So the guy there on the right wants to talk about grass. And because he's from England, he pronounces it grass with the sound ah. And then the person he's talking to on the left there, she understands what he's talking about, even though she actually says it grass, because she's from the US probably. And there's a lot of words like this where we say it one way and someone else says it differently. Like all of these ones, you could say grass, glass, pass, plaster, bath. But if you're from England, you'd probably use a different vowel. So if you're from the UK, you'd probably say grass, glass, pass, plaster, and bath. Whereas the Americans would use the ah vowel and get grass, glass, pass, plaster, bath. This is a thing called the trap bath split, where everyone used to say it. Well, when I say everyone, in English, the most common pronunciation a couple of centuries ago was the way that most Americans say it nowadays, where all of these words were pronounced with an ah. But then at some point in the UK, some people started splitting off some of those words into using an ah, which now they use in things like bath. So people from England will say trap with the ah and bath with an ah. Most people, not everyone, there's parts of England where they say ah for all of it. And then there's other words where some will do one and some will do the other, like dance and answer. I say dance and answer. Other parts of Australia even might say dance and answer and stuff. But like, how does this even happen? Why do we have, like, in the same language, we're all speaking English, how did we end up with a particular set of words suddenly having a different vowel sound to the way that other people who speak the exact same language pronounce those words? Okay, so first principle is sounds will change. And what happens is, with a language, when you've got a group of people who are kind of isolated from the rest of the speaker community, they will, on their own, come up with little things that are specific to them. And it might be sound changes. They might say a particular vowel a little differently. This particular phoneme might be pronounced differently to how people elsewhere in the world will do it. If you think about how Australian English has only been separate from the rest of the English-speaking world for a couple of hundred years, but Australian English, for all these different historical reasons and reasons of contact with other languages and Indigenous languages and other migrant groups and stuff, has become quite specific, so quite distinctive is probably a better way to say it. And this happens. So I'll show you another thing that happens in history. So at some point, maybe a couple of thousand years ago, we had a bunch of old Germanic people like this, and they had this many dots that they needed to describe. And back then, in their language, which now we call Proto-Germanic, they would have said something like Sieben or Sieben. And no one's exactly sure what the word was, but it must have been something like that, because what they can do is they know which of the people who live nowadays speak a language which is descended from them. So basically, those old Germanic people, over the last 1,000 years, sort of spread across, or 2,000 years or so, spread out across sections of Europe. And in the individual areas, the groups who lived there close together would develop their own sort of specific local pronunciations and stuff. And something that happened is certain sounds in their language changed. So, for example, in modern times, we've got English, which is descended from Proto-Germanic, and we've also got German, or modern German. And so in English, we still have this word, but in English, nowadays we pronounce it as seven with a V, whereas German has sieben with a B. If you just change the B to a V, obviously it's the same word. So what all that's happened here is, like, a particular sound has shifted from being a stop to a fricative, with the sort of closest available place of articulation staying the same. It's just that the manner of articulation has changed from a B to a V. And there's there's lots of examples of this. So like in English, we say seven, have, live, love, over. Whereas in German, they say sieben, habe, lebe, liebe, und über. You can tell they're more or less the same words. In fact, they are the same words. They're just the same words with 2,000 years of the pronunciation sort of drifting off because different groups weren't interacting anymore. The word for this is cognates, when you've got two different words in the modern language, in two different modern languages, but they're from the same origin. So even though you can see that the sounds have changed, you can see it's technically the same word. Okay, so that's the first thing. Sounds change, and sounds will sort of follow patterns of how they change. Second thing to think about is that not only do the sounds change, it's not only a phonological thing, this is also semantics. The meanings of words will change. And over time, a lot of words, the meaning for various reasons will drift off into new meanings. So one of the most obvious examples, because everyone knows this, is the word gay, which originally in English, it's been used in English and written English for, there's examples 800 years ago or something, meant happy, because we borrowed it from Old French, and that's what it means in French. It means happy. And so it used to basically mean happy, joyous, something like that. But quite early, it started taking on various slang meanings or like extra meanings. So in the 1600s, you can find things that are written where they use the term gay woman as a slang term to mean a prostitute, for example. And then they'd say a gay man, using that as sort of a slang term meaning a womanizer, like a guy who was really popular with the ladies, and so on. And so, like, you can see all these little sort of weird little, I guess, derogatory meanings of words and stuff start to crop up. And then later on, there was, in the 1800s, ultimately they don't know how early people have been using these words. All that they can tell is this is the first time they saw it written down, that they had proof of it. Probably people were saying it even earlier. There was a slang term back in America when they used to have a lot of people were hobos. They were sort of walking around and jumping on trains and stuff and going from town to town looking for work, but they didn't sort of have a fixed address. There was this big hobo underground sort of slightly criminal culture in America. And in the hobo community, there was a slang term, a gay cat, and a gay cat was a young hobo, particularly young hobos who would hang around with an older hobo who they were getting to look after them, maybe trade some favors, if you know what I mean, and things like that. And that slang term seems to have sort of become a bit of a sort of gay community in-group sort of word, that they've known that it's existed at least since like the early 1900s or like the 1930s and stuff, where it sort of worked its way into prison slang as like a young gay man in prison, and so a young homosexual man in prison was called gay, and so on. And then it sort of became a word that was used within the homosexual community, and then it's sort of become a mainstream word and things like that. So these words can change meaning over time, and it can be quite gradual. It can be because of a certain usage that catches on because we need a new word for something, so we just use a word we've already got, or a word that's used within a particular community and then it becomes widespread, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of examples of this, like the word nice used to mean someone who wasn't very smart, like someone who was completely clueless and unknowing, dopey, foolish, So you'd see in older English texts people saying someone was nice, meaning that they were really foolish. And then it's gradually over time become a positive word. It's a very pleasant, a very nice, agreeable, pleasant word. Or something like awful, which used to just mean straight up awe-inspiring. Like you would be filled with awe by this. It would be so impressive. But then nowadays, over the centuries, it's become very negative, like, oh, that's awful. Or naive, which basically meant, naive is from a word that means to be born in Old French. So naive is like, it's the state you're in when you're born. Or that's kind of how we understand it now when they go, he's very naive, very childish, a bit clueless, a bit ignorant. It didn't used to be used like that. It used to be used mostly like when someone says like native or like a natural state. You'd say this was the natural state of things because, it's still connected to being born. Like this is a state that is when it started out. Okay, so if this is Great Britain and Ireland, from about 400 onwards, you had the Anglo-Saxons gradually moving in, who brought their language with them, which became Old English. So sort of the first stage in what we're speaking now. But then you had lots of other vocabulary dumped on top of it from other sources, such as 1066 onwards, the Normans invaded, bringing their dialect of French with them, Norman French. And then we've actually absorbed a lot more French from that later on as well. So the French being very close to England and influential and, through politics and stuff, there's a lot of French that's come into English. But I'll show you something interesting that's happened here. So Norman French and other dialects of French were a bit different to each other because, like we talked about before, meanings change, sounds change. And in Norman French, you had a W sound where other kinds of French would have a G sound, particularly as time went on. Modern French now has a G in all of these words I'm going to show you. So in Norman, there are words that we got from the Normans, from Norman French, such as warden and reward and warranty. And we've borrowed these exact same words again later on, but with a different pronunciation and a slightly different meaning. So these exact same words have been borrowed into English again later after the Normans as guardian, regard, and guarantee. So if you look at it, you can see that warden and guardian, they're the same word. All that they've done is just the first consonant has changed. And the meanings are similar. They're not exactly the same, but they are very similar. And then reward and regard, if you think of something like, I hold him in very high regard, like that kind of meaning of it, that again, you can sort of see the link there. A guarantee and a warranty, they're similar. But at any rate, it's kind of interesting when you can get the same word twice, but borrow it from two different people at two different times and end up with two completely different words in modern English. Okay, that's all for now.